Today we're taking a look at one of the most iconic off-road vehicles in America, the Toyota 4Runner. This has a well-deserved reputation for reliability, dependability, and off-road ability, but it also has a well-deserved reputation for being a little on the old side. This model first debuted back in 2009, and over the last few years, rather than give us substantive changes for the 4Runner, they've given us more off-road oriented editions, the TRD Pro, the TRD off-road versions, and of course special editions like the Nightshade edition. And for 2021, we're getting a few more tweaks to the 4Runner. We're going to be getting LED headlamps and a few tweaks here and there, a color change to the TRD Pro model, the one that we're looking at today. This is sort of an army green color, and for 2021, it's going to go to Lunar Rock. But if you're waiting for an all-new 4Runner, you may have to wait for another few years, because the rumor mill is telling us that we may not see a completely redesigned 4Runner until 2023 at this point. That should come out in the 2022 calendar year, but 2023 model year. Since this model launched back in 2009, it's had a number of different front-end treatments. Again, we're driving the current generation TRD Pro version. So we have this strong bar right here with Toyota spelled out, black plastic down here at the bottom of the bumper. This is not part of the skid plate, although we do have a skid plate right down there below that. We have an interesting twist here where we have LED fog lights and incandescent headlights, incandescent high beams and low beams. But for 2021, the headlights are going to be redesigned, and we're going to get some new all-LED modules in every trim. The Jeep Grand Cherokee is a long-time and very direct competitor to the Toyota 4Runner, but at this point in time, they're quite different vehicles, even though they're almost the same length at 191.3 inches long. The Grand Cherokee gives us a bit more ground clearance depending on the option that you get. It has independent suspension all the way around, whereas the 4Runner still has a solid rear axle. There's certainly pros and cons to that as well. But the biggest difference is that this is a body-on-frame SUV, and the Jeep Grand Cherokee is a unibody SUV, although logically you could also call the Grand Cherokee a crossover, because in the truest sense of the word, it is, whereas this is a bit more truck-like. The difference is that under the 4Runner's skin, we have a true frame. That's where the engine, the transmission, the wheels, the axles, and of course the tow hitch, that's where they all bolt to the vehicle. Whereas in the Grand Cherokee, the frame and the unibody are all integrated with one another. With modern unibody designs, a big advantage is rigidity, but with body-on-frame designs like this, generally speaking, the advantage is going to be ruggedness and the ability to swap out the frame if you wanted to aftermarket. So there are a few companies out there that will give you truly rugged, heavy-duty frames, and if you want to do a lot of lift work with your vehicle, then you're going to want a frame underneath, and that's why we see a frame still in something like a Jeep Wrangler. You could also consider this a direct competitor to the four-door Wrangler, formerly known as the Wrangler Unlimited, but the big difference between this and the Wrangler and the Grand Cherokee is that we have an optional third row in the rear. The 4Runner's bulky design continues out to the rear, where this looks a little bit bigger than its numbers would otherwise indicate. So if you're looking for a vehicle that could fit in some of those tighter situations, but has a bigger presence, then you might want to get the 4Runner. These are combination tail lamp modules, so we have turn signals and backup lights that are incandescent elements, and then brake lights that are LEDs. Down at the bottom of the bumper, we have a hitch receiver. This is rated to tow up to 5,000 pounds when properly equipped. The 4Runner used to be able to tow more, but it no longer has the optional V8 that it did once upon a time. Unlike the Lexus GX460, which is related to the 4Runner, or the Land Cruiser Prado, which is also related, we have a lift gate, not a swinging door to the side. A handy feature that we just don't see on very many SUVs anymore is a rear glass that opens separately from the lift gate. Although this one's a little bit different than what we see in some full-size SUVs, it's a powered window that slides down right there into this section of the hatch. There's a button on the inside that allows you to open and close it from the inside of the vehicle, or you can use the lock and unlock buttons right back here on the hatch to both lock the vehicle or unlock the vehicle and raise or lower the glass. As with most of their lineup in North America, the 4Runner has a decent number of active safety technologies, standard and optional. But it's worth noting that Toyota puts their radar sensor right here, between the Toyota spelled out on top and the license plate right there. That's exactly where you'd end up putting a brush guard or a winch if you were going to put a front-mounted winch on your 4Runner. So if you do plan on doing that aftermarket, keep in mind that it may interfere with the pre-collision warning, the autonomous braking, and the radar adaptive cruise control functionality. That's the reason that Jeep, in a number of their recent vehicles, put the radar sensor right behind the windshield. You'll see that in the Wrangler and of course the Ram 1500 pickup truck line as well. That means that if you plan on modifying the front end of your Jeep, the radar adaptive cruise control and those autonomous braking systems will still function. All 4Runner models sold in the US get the same tried and true drivetrain. This is a 4-liter, 6-cylinder engine. It produces 270 horsepower and 278 pound-feet of torque. It sends power to the ground via a 5-speed automatic transmission and your choice of rear-wheel drive or 2 different 4-wheel drive systems. There's a full-time 4-wheel drive system in the limited trim and then part-time 4-wheel drive systems in the other models. Although this engine and transmission combination have proved to be ultra reliable, it falls behind the competition in a number of key areas. Fuel economy is on the low side. We also don't have as much power as you'd find in some of the turbocharged or V8 or diesel options out there. The off-road ratios, although aggressive for the Toyota lineup, are not as aggressive as the ones that we'll find in some of the competition. Of course, that new Ford Bronco is especially aggressive in its off-road ratios, and this engine is not as smooth as some of those newer engine options out there. The model that I'm driving today has a power driver's seat with two-way adjustable lumbar support, and I give this model 8 out of 10 points. We have a tilt telescopic steering column with a decent range of motion. One reason that you might want to get the 4Runner over an off-road version of the Toyota Tacoma is that the seat and the seating position is certainly a lot more comfortable than what we find in the Tacoma. The big difference is that in the 4Runner, you're sitting in a much more upright position. You'll notice that although this is not as upright as some of the alternatives out there, it's certainly more upright than the Tacoma, where it really feels like you have your arms and your legs stretched way out in front of you in order to be able to drive it. The model that we're driving has a power passenger seat as well, but it doesn't have the same range of motion as the driver. It's missing the two-way lumbar. Hopping into the back seat, we certainly find a bit more room than in the Toyota RAV4, so if you're looking for something in the Toyota lineup that gives you a bit more legroom without stepping up to something really big, this might be an option. I have about 6 inches of legroom sitting right here comfortably behind myself. If I scoot all the way over to the right side of the vehicle, where this front seat is all the way back in its tracks, I have about 1 inch of legroom left. Thanks to the very square proportions of the 4Runner, I also have a reasonable amount of headroom. If I put my head all the way back there to the headrest, I have about 1.5 inches of headroom. The ceiling does have a pretty definite dish right here because this model has the optional moonroof, but it doesn't cut down on second row passenger headroom. Now the second row seats do not slide forward and backward, so you can't apportion space between the optional third row and the second row. Keep in mind that the third row in the 4Runner is a pretty tight third row. We don't have it on this model, but the second row seats still fold in the same fashion. It's sort of an old school design where the seat bottom cushion flips up and then the seat back cushion folds forward. I wish the sequence was a bit more automated. It is kind of a pain to have to fold the headrest separately from the seat back, but it does give us a very flat load floor. The second row seats also give us a bit of a recline functionality. This is the most upright position. I can pull a little lever here on the side and get a pretty surprising recline. The 4Runner is available as either a 3-row or a 2-row vehicle, although the 2-row option seems to be a bit more popular. If you choose the 2-row version, then we get an absolutely enormous cargo area back here, around 47 cubic feet of storage space. You'll notice that the ceiling is pretty high and the opening is large and boxy. We also have a very vertical hatch, which really helps out cargo practicality. So if you're looking for something that can hold more than the RAV4 or CR-V, that's where the 4Runner comes in. Kind of an odd option in the 4Runner is the sliding load floor. It locks into 2 different positions right there. This one is the most extended position possible. I suppose you could use this as sort of a seat for tailgating. Maximum capacity is 440 pounds, so you couldn't put 2 larger people on this, although you could put your cooler there and have it a little bit closer to the party. The downside is that this takes up some cargo room, and the cargo area in the 4Runner is already a little bit unusually shaped. Upon closer inspection, you'll notice that the cargo area actually curves in a little bit there towards the bottom. That's somewhat unusual, and it really accentuates the fact that this bumper sticks out quite far from the opening of the cargo area. That's probably part of the reason for that sliding load floor right there, because it locks in its first position right there level with the bumper. As we look around the interior, keep in mind that options and features are going to change depending on the version of the 4Runner that you get. Since we're driving the TRD Pro, we have a ton of the off-road features here, and unusually the controls for most of these features are located right here above the rear view mirror rather than in the center console. There's a traction control button, an A-track button, rear locker button right there, and then we have the progress control button over here. This gives us uphill and downhill progress control. You rotate this dial around for the speed and you enable and disable the system with this button right here. And then there's a terrain management style system right over here. We press that button right there, and then you rotate around for rocks, moguls, loose rocks, mud, sand, dirt, etc. There's an SOS button for the vehicle's built-in telematics services. We then have the buttons for the universal garage remote control right there, and then the controls for the moonroof. The moonroof is a pretty standard size. It's just over the driver and front passengers' heads. We get height adjustable shoulder belts, 2-way adjustable headrests with the TRD logo embroidered right there on the front. The seats are upholstered in Toyota's latest imitation leather upholstery. We have some red stitching right there on the side, and this interior has a pretty monochromatic look. We get some soft touch materials over here on the driver and front passenger doors, stitched materials right there up top, soft touch armrest, then hard plastics lower on the door. The monochromatic look continues as we move on over to the dashboard. We find a soft touch injection molded upper section of the dashboard, and then what looks like metal but is actually an imitation metal accent below that. The glove compartment is a slot-style glove compartment. It was just a little bit too small to fit a larger tablet computer, although some of the smaller ones might fit. In the center of the dashboard, we have an LED display clock, 2 large air vents, and then one of Toyota's more recent infotainment systems that does give us smartphone integration, as you can see there. Since we're driving one of the top-end trims, there's also a factory mapping interface if you'd rather map that way. Below that, we have the controls for the 2-zone automatic climate control system. You tell that this is definitely from a slightly different era at Toyota. The buttons are all a little bit larger than average. Pretty easy to control with gloves, however. And then we have some LED displays there as well. Continuing below that, we find the USB input for that infotainment system and a lot of small storage cubbies. These would not be large enough to fit some of the larger smartphones like the one that I have connected to the system right now. This version of the 4Runner continues to use a mechanical linkage for the 4-wheel drive system, and this is a part-time 4-wheel drive system. So we have 2 high, 4 low, and neutral if you want to flat tow your 4Runner. This is one of the few vehicles available in America with the neutral mode like this in the transfer case, so you can tow it behind your RV if you wanted to. Next to the 4-wheel drive lever, we have one of 2 cup holders. We then have a gated style shifter right here, sport mode over to the left. The other cup holder is right back here, and you can see that there's a slot where you can put some of those smartphones in there, but you can't lay it quite sideways if you want to use that cup holder. We then have the controls for the heated seats, and then this is the button that opens and closes the rear window on the hatch. Between the front seats, we have a padded center console. If we open this up, we find a moderately sized storage bin. There's a 12-volt power outlet in there. I was not able to fit a gallon of milk inside, but it was really close. Moving over to the driver's side, we have a 4-dial analog instrument cluster with a color multifunction display in the middle. This feels a little bit old school compared to some of the competitive displays out there, but it does give us all the same basic information. The steering wheel is a leather-wrapped 4-spoke wheel shared with Toyota's truck lineup. We have sport grips up top and perforated sections on the side. This is one of Toyota's older steering wheel designs, so the controls for the cruise control system are here on a stalk that rotates with the steering wheel rather than on the front of the wheel. Since this is an adaptive cruise control system, we have a distance keeping button right here, we have the lane departure warning button right down there, and then these controls relate to that multifunction LCD between the speedometer and tachometer. On the left side of the wheel, we have buttons for the infotainment system, and then some dedicated phone hang-up and pickup buttons. Out on the road, the first thing you'll notice about the TRD Pro version of the 4Runner is that kind of droning exhaust note. I'm not a huge fan of the TRD exhaust in this model. If I had the option, I would just skip that particular option. But aside from that, you'll notice that the 4Runner has a pretty decent on-road ride. But on the other hand, it's definitely not speedy. 0 to 60 happened in this model in 8 seconds even, and 60 to 0 took 127 feet. Those are definitely longer times and longer distances than you'll find in most of the direct competition. That all has to do with the older 5-speed automatic transmission, and of course the V6 engine that doesn't give us as much power as some of the competitive V6s, V8s, and of course turbocharged options as well. Before I get any further in this video, I should warn you that I have not been able to get this 4Runner off-road this week, unfortunately. There are a number of very large wildfires all the way around me. The closest one is about 7 miles away, and as a result, the private off-road course that I normally use is completely closed. They've asked us not to drive on that course for fear of fire danger. But if you want to know how the 4Runner does off-road, I have a number of other videos on my channel where I've already taken this off-road. Really, not a lot has changed about the 4Runner's off-road ability over the last 10 years or so. When it comes to handling dynamics, this reminds me an awful lot of the GMT 360 family of SUVs, things like the Trailblazer, the Bravada, and of course the GMC Envoy. We have an independent suspension up front, solid rear axle in the back, 9.6 inches of ground clearance, and curb weight that is not exactly light. If you're looking for something with good off-road ability and sharper on-road driving dynamics, the Grand Cherokee certainly comes to mind. The Grand Cherokee is no lightweight, but it does have a full 4-corner independent suspension, and of course optional air suspension options, etc. That's certainly going to make the Grand Cherokee more on-road focused, a little bit more dynamic when it comes to winding mountain roads like this. But the Grand Cherokee is still going to be a little bit heavy, and any of the vehicles in this segment really are going to be more focused at off-road ability. In terms of a grade, I'm going to give handling a C, but keep in mind that the 4Runner is not sloppy by any stretch. I think the suspension is very well tuned. This just doesn't have the grip, and it has a lot of body roll, a lot of tip and dive, a lot of lean. And you'll certainly notice the difference if you get the 4Runner with KDSS. Now, for some reason, KDSS is not available in this TRD Pro. KDSS is an interesting hydraulic system that gives us many of the benefits of an electronically disconnecting sway bar without some of the mechanical complexity, although admittedly we have some of the hydraulic complexity in that system. This is a similar system to what we find in the Lexus GX 460 and a number of other vehicles out there on the market. The system employs hydraulic rams on the front and rear stabilizer bars. So if we're in a corner like this, the front and rear stabilizer bars are getting more or less the same force because the vehicle is turning around the corner. But if you get the vehicle in off-camber situations, then the front and rear stabilizer bars are allowed to act independently and give you more wheel articulation. Out on a rougher road surface like the gravel road that we're on here, the 4Runner delivers an excellent ride. And even though we're driving the off-road focused version, I think that the ride is still a great balance between on-road and off-road performance. When comparing the TRD Pro version of the 4Runner to the other versions of the 4Runner, I think handling takes more of a hit than ride quality. Now let's talk about some of these off-road assist systems. Crawl control is available only in 4 low. That's when the transfer case is locked and it's in its lowest ratio mode. Toyota's crawl control mode is not the smoothest crawl control mode that I've ever seen. Now this is a little bit smoother than in some of the other vehicles that I've been in by Toyota, but you'll still find smoother crawl control and progress control in something like the Jeep Wrangler or in the Jeep Grand Cherokee. For most off-roading situations, the terrain management system is going to be just fine. Now some people have given the 4Runner a bit of a hard time for not having a solid front axle or having a locking front axle anymore. You won't get any argument from me that there are going to be some situations where you might want a locking front axle. However, the situations where you want a front locking differential, those are an awful lot fewer. Especially in a vehicle that has a good traction management system that can send power across the front axle using the brake-based system, and we still have a locking rear differential and a locking center coupling. This has a true 2-speed transfer case. It's not a Torsen center differential, although you can get a Torsen full-time all-wheel drive system in the limited version. Toyota claims that in some situations, for instance, where you're driving around a steep slope, that having a locking front coupling may actually give you a disadvantage because you may want some additional slip to get additional steering control, and that's why they don't have one in the 4Runner. Of course, the other reason that we don't find one in the 4Runner is going to be cost. It's clearly cheaper to not have a locking front differential, and they also decided that this generation of the 4Runner should still have some on-road ability, and that's why we have independent suspension up front. In our cabin noise test at 50 miles an hour, we got 73 decibels in here. It's a little bit quieter than I had suspected with these very off-road focused tires. I think that has to do with the sound deadening that we find on the floorboards. If you get the limited trim, things are going to be a little bit quieter as well. Over a week of mixed driving and no off-roading, this 4Runner has averaged 16 miles per gallon. It's definitely on the low end of this segment. Certainly below the Grand Cherokee with the V6 engine. Something like the Jeep Wrangler even will get slightly better fuel economy depending on exactly how you treat it and the options that you get on that Wrangler. And something like the new Ford Bronco is promising slightly better fuel economy as well. A lot of that has to do, I think, with the older 5-speed automatic transmission and, of course, the older engine that we find under the hood. I really wish that Toyota had given this an 8-speed automatic transmission the last time it was refreshed. They already had that 8-speed in their portfolio, and they also had some newer engines that they could have put under the hood. To be honest, out on the road, my only major complaint about the 4Runner is this combination of 4-liter V6 and 5-speed automatic transmission. And maybe even the V6 would be fine if we had one of Toyota's newer 8-speed or even their 10-speed automatic transmission, but as it is, this transmission just doesn't have the right gear ratios, I think, anymore. You'll really notice that out on the road compared to the newer competition. When hill climbing, the engine really seems to be lugging around in these higher gears. You have to dig an awful lot further into the throttle to get a lower gear, and then you just don't get the kind of acceleration that you might be hoping for. A 0 to 60 time of 8 seconds is not especially swift, and I have to think that a lot of that has to do with this 5-speed automatic transmission. When the Grand Cherokee moved from an older 5-speed and 6-speed automatic combo to the new ZF 8-speed transmission, it lost a full second 0 to 60, and they didn't really change anything else about the vehicle. The 5-speed automatic is also likely to blame when it comes to the lower fuel economy scores. I just have to say I wish Toyota had given this their newer 3.5-liter V6 and one of their newer automatic transmissions. For 2021, the 4Runner starts at $36,340. That's for the base SR5 trim. You can get that as either a 5 or a 7-passenger vehicle. Even though the 4Runner seems to be as old as the dawning of time, and we certainly have an older engine and transmission under the hood, Toyota has been very aggressive at bringing all of their latest active safety technologies into all of their vehicles, and that includes even the base model of the SR5. So it does have a number of standard active safety or driver assistance features that you won't find in most of the competition standard. If you want the TRD off-road model, that will start at $40,305. There is a premium package available that brings you things like the Softex upholstery seats for $43,050, and those are the versions that will use Toyota's kinetic dynamic suspension system. For people that live out in the country, say on a ranch or on a farm, or you just live down a long series of gravel roads and needed something that's a little bit more secure in winter weather, then I would suggest the limited trim. This would also apply if you're living in snow country and you're looking for something like the 4Runner simply for those situations. That's $45,395 for the rear-wheel drive model, $47,430 for the all-wheel drive model. This is the all-wheel drive version of the 4Runner, and in some traditionalist circles, you would call this system all-wheel drive because it's always on, and you'd call the other systems available in the 4Runner four-wheel drive because they're part-time systems. The key thing to note with the limited trim is that the system is not less robust than the other four-wheel drive systems available in the 4Runner. It's just different, and it's targeted at a different customer. It's targeted at someone that wants that sure-footedness of having all four wheels powered all the time. Remember that full-time four-wheel four-wheel drive systems, generally speaking, should not be used on dry pavement or simply wet pavement. So if you're out there on your favorite winding mountain road and it's raining, this is not the time you want to turn on a full-time four-wheel drive system, because the center coupling is completely locked, and that means that the front differential and the rear differential's inputs cannot spin at different rates. This can actually end up in a loss of control situation. But the system that we find in the limited trim of the 4Runner is on all the time, so it's going to give you added traction in even that kind of situation. Then, of course, we get the TRD Pro model. That's the range-topping version at this time. It starts just over $50,000. At this point in time, the only logical competitors for the 4Runner are the Jeep Wrangler and the Jeep Grand Cherokee. That's because the Ford Bronco is not available for sale yet in the United States, but the Bronco will certainly be an absolutely direct competitor once it is on sale a little bit later in 2020 or possibly early 2021. We don't know exactly what the ongoing pandemic is going to do for availability just yet. In many ways, the 4Runner lives in the in-between land, between the Grand Cherokee and the Jeep Wrangler. The Jeep Wrangler is available as a 2-door or a 4-door vehicle. It has solid axles. It's a body-on-frame vehicle. But it goes to extremes that we don't see available in the 4Runner, with the removable windshield, the removable doors, the removable top, etc. Jeep also provides more engine options, more recent transmission designs. It's a solid axle setup front and rear, and it's certainly designed for more aggressive off-roading from the factory than we see in the 4Runner. The important thing to remember about off-road ability is that your modifications after it leaves the factory are very, very important. So off the factory, there are going to be versions of the Wrangler that are going to be more off-road capable than the 4Runner. It's a little bit more nimble. We have those solid axles, etc. It has greater ground clearance, better wheel articulation, and better approach and departure angles. But there are ways to modify your 4Runner aftermarket to be better than the factory-equipped Wrangler models. So the key thing to remember here is when I'm talking about off-road capability, I'm talking about from the factory or all things being equal. So if you've modified your Wrangler and you've modified your 4Runner similarly, logically the Wrangler is still going to be a little bit more off-road capable. The main reason that folks tend to gravitate towards the 4Runner is Toyota's reputation for reliability and dependability. The Wrangler hasn't exactly been bad when it comes to reliability. There have been a few recalls, but a lot of the reliability issues we see in the Wrangler are simply the result of it being much more modern. It has newer engines, newer transmissions that don't have that long track record that we see in the 4Runner. Remember, the 4Runner's engine and transmission combo is pretty old at this point, but that does mean that it's well proven. People know how to work on them. There are a lot of aftermarket accessories available as well, so there's certainly pros and cons to this setup. Just on the other side of the 4Runner, we have the Jeep Grand Cherokee. The Grand Cherokee is going to be more on-road focused, more civilized. The interior feels more modern. It feels a little bit more like a luxury, rugged vehicle. It's still very, very off-road capable, and some might argue more off-road capable than the 4Runner, depending on the version that you get. There is, of course, the rugged Trailhawk version of the Jeep Grand Cherokee that will certainly take you places that you wouldn't be able to go in, say, an SR5 version of the 4Runner. But a lot of regular off-road fans tend to scoff at the Grand Cherokee because it is a unibody vehicle, not a body-on-frame vehicle, and it has no solid axles at all in this generation. But it does have an adaptive four-corner air suspension and a lot of great electronics going on to send power to wherever it's needed. The Grand Cherokee also offers a number of different four-wheel drive systems, 2-speed transfer cases, available diesel engine, a V8 engine as well if that's what you're looking for, and greater towing capacity than we find in the 4Runner. Aside from these two options, at the moment in the United States, we don't really have any alternatives for the 4Runner in the same price range. You could look at something like the new Land Rover Defender, obviously, a Mercedes-Benz G-Wagon, the really expensive end of this, or something like the Lexus GX 460 or a Toyota Land Cruiser, which are going to be sideways, much more expensive alternatives to the 4Runner. Under $50,000, you really aren't going to find too many dedicated off-road vehicles in the United States at the moment, although again, we are going to see a few more coming soon. Outside of these options, obviously there are midsize or compact pickup trucks out there that are very off-road focused, like the Gladiator, the Tacoma, but they're obviously not the same thing. If you're looking for an off-road SUV that will have 3 rows or perhaps 2 rows and a lot of cargo area that's enclosed in the vehicle, that's certainly not going to be those pickup truck options. Although quite logically, something like a Toyota Tacoma with a pickup truck bed cover would be an interesting alternative to something like the 4Runner. It's obviously going to be longer, and that is the tricky part when it comes to comparing here. The Gladiator, the Tacoma, the Colorado Canyon, etc., they're all going to be considerably longer than a 4-door Wrangler or the 4Runner. Be sure and let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section. And if you were shopping for a vehicle in this segment, I'm also interested to hear what you think about these factory off-road packages like the TRD Pro and the TRD Off-Road. In my mind, if I were buying an off-road 4Runner, I would probably just get something along the lines of perhaps a SR5, or if I wanted the KDSS suspension, the base version of the TRD off-road, and then I would make the modifications myself aftermarket. I would spend, instead of the $50,000 that we find on the TRD Pro, you could buy a TRD off-road in base form, and then spend $10,000 on extra bumpers or winch kits or things like that. I think that's the direction that I would personally go if I were getting a RAV4. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below. Find me over at facebook.com/AlexNautos, over at Instagram, all those other social things, and I'll see all of you later.